and been really influential to my own work and to many people, and really raising the bar about what research with movements looks like and what it can do, what it can achieve. And so, yeah, I'm super honored to be here and glad you can make it, Chris. And I'm going to start out by asking you if you'd like to introduce yourself more about who you are, what you do, and how you approach research.
Sure. First of all, Jen, I just want to say thank you for that that really lovely introduction, and I want to thank Jacqueline and Beatrice and everyone else who's like put in the work to create the infrastructure for this event. I felt like there's been a lot of intentionality here, and I feel quite honored by that. Plus, I'm a real fan of people like preparing stuff well. And I appreciate that this has been prepared well so that we can hopefully maximize our time together. So in terms of saying a little bit more about myself and maybe giving you all a sense, because I don't at all expect you to be familiar with stuff that I've done in the past or even really have a sense of who I am. So I'll just kind of say a few things. As Jen mentioned in my introduction, I'm from Alaska. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska originally. I grew up on Dena'ina territory there, and that actually profoundly shaped my experience and how I think about activism and how I think about colonialism, settler colonialism in particular. I spent a bunch of years living along the US West Coast, where I went to university and then eventually I went and did a PhD at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And all along the West Coast, I was involved in a variety of social and ecological justice organizing efforts. And I moved into the Canadian context back in 2007. I moved to Sudbury, Ontario, in Atikamekw territory. And I lived there for 5 years. And that was actually a tremendously illuminating experience. And you'll start to see that one of the continuities for me is that I've lived in many places that were based on resource extraction economies. And that has actually made me think a lot about extraction and how extraction is connected to research too. In 2012, I moved to Ottawa, where I currently live here on unceded Algonquin territory. And basically the way I spend my time is I did that PhD at University of California, Santa Cruz, not with ever the intention of becoming a full-time academic. I didn't want to be a professor. I went to graduate school in order to basically try to gather resources to support the movements and the struggles that I care about, and try and put that in as much as possible into furthering, eventual and subsequent kinds of campaigns and organizing efforts. And I've effectively deprofessionalized as an academic. That's how I understand myself. I call myself a deprofessionalized academic. And I maintain a very tenuous connection with Carleton University here in Ottawa, where I have a research affiliation, which allows me to have a library card and an email address, which is great for my purposes. And I otherwise devote my time to activist work and writing and trying to do some of this kind of intellectual work with movements. And that's really how I've kind of shaped and dedicated my time. And a lot of what I imagine we're going to talk about today is coming out of particularly the experience I had doing the research for the book Another Politics, talking across today's transformative movements that came out in 2014. And just to encapsulate that briefly, that involved me traveling across North America, both nation states of the Canadian context and the US context, doing interviews with longtime anti-authoritarian activists and organizers about the kinds of lessons we're learning, the kinds of challenges we're facing, and some of the big questions that we're grappling with. And I learned a tremendous amount through that process from people engaged in organizing work who I consider comrades, but also about research itself. Like it really profoundly forced me to think about how to engage in a kind of partnership with people engaged in movements in an ethical way that could really further the politics that I care about. So that really frames how I think about stuff and probably will frame a lot of what I have to say today.
Okay, thanks for telling us more about what how you got to here today. Okay, so in your view, what role can research play in transformative systemic social change in struggles for social and environmental justice, but also in what ways can it harm?
So I think that there's a lot of different roles that research can play. And I suspect that's why we're all here today, right? To try to think about some of those different roles. And a lot of the way that I tend to think about it is that there's kind of a spectrum
Je
of
pense qu'il y a un spectre de possibilités pour la recherche. D'abord, je crois que l'idée de la recherche est contrainte dans la recherche académique seulement. La production de connaissances se fait uniquement dans les universités par des gens que nous appelons des universitaires. Mais ce que j'aimerais dire dès le début, et cela vient d'un communiste italien, n'importe quelle personne qui est dans le monde, qui travaille dans le monde, qui s'occupe des enfants, qui ont un emploi, qui essaie de naviguer quelque chose, fait du travail intellectuel. Nous posons des questions. Nous enquêtons sur des circonstances. Nous essayons de trouver des solutions pour naviguer ce qui peuvent être des circonstances difficiles. Ainsi, je pense que nous ne devrions pas rendre la recherche exceptionnelle. En fait, nous devons regarder les différentes réflexions et engagements qui se produisent partout autour de nous. Puis, je pense que nous pouvons penser à la recherche avec un grand R. La recherche faite par des gens qui ont des lettres après leur nom, par exemple, ou des affiliations, par exemple, avec des institutions. Donc, quel est le spectre des possibilités pour les gens qui font de la recherche? Et dans ce spectre, d'un côté, je pense que qu'il y a un aspect nuisible. Par exemple, pensons aux thèses. Oui, pensons par exemple à l'organisme de sécurité du Canada. Il y a des gens qui sont très bons pour écrire des rapports. Certaines de ces personnes, cela peut être lié, par exemple, au mouvement contre la mondialisation. Mais donc, il faut considérer qu'il y a des parties de l'État qui font de la recherche et ce sont des ennemis. Ils font de la recherche sur nous car ils nous considèrent comme une menace. Et c'est le genre de recherche qui peut être très nuisible. Donc, nous devons y porter attention. Il y a des agences policières de différents genres qui font de la recherche également. Et cela leur permet de mieux de mieux nous contrôler, en fait. Il y a d'autres types de recherche également. Par exemple, j'ai un ami qui est diplômé en géologie.
That so much of the research in the area of geology is in the service of fossil fuel companies, right? Resource extraction, corporations of various kinds. So there's those kinds of research as well, right? That are actually about more effectively destroying the world and turning it into profit, like a profit-making entity for companies. So I mean, I raise those examples because I think it's important to think about the kind of most extreme end of the spectrum of research that's possible, right? Like there's research that's actively working to undermine our efforts to make the world better and is actively involved in destroying the world in various ways. Now, more into the moving along the spectrum, I think there are also forms of research that are more inadvertently aligned with harm, right? They're less about people who are researchers who are saying they want to try and undermine our efforts or they want to try to actively further colonialism and capitalism or something like that, but they're in various ways complicit in those systems, in those ruling institutions through the research that they do. I mean, here we could take just the example of thinking about the discipline of anthropology, right? And its long history and in engaging in colonial efforts around the world, and in actually sort of parsing out the world in a European colonial like organization. Now, I think anthropology has in interesting ways reckoned, or at least parts of anthropology have in interesting ways tried to reckon with some of that past, but it's certainly there. And we could similarly, I think, look at, say, political science as a discipline, right? That in many ways adopts the state mentality, right? Adopts the kind of ruling language and orientation of dominant institutions, and tries to like think about how they operate and work within them, and rarely actually calls into question any of the kind of major systems that operate through the state. I mean, and we won't even talk about economics, right, as a discipline. I mean, economics, there's a lot to say about economics and its complicity. But so in those cases, I think there actually are people who think that what they're doing is worthwhile, right? Think that what they're doing is in service of something, but in many ways, it's actually very much in line with ruling relations and institutions. It's certainly not in any way explicitly aligned with those of us who are involved in transformative struggles, right? So I think on the other end of the spectrum, I start to look toward forms of research that are actually about very consciously taking up the standpoint of people who are trying to overturn this existing order and build a more sustainable and equitable society. And that does necessarily mean confronting ruling institutions and ruling relations. And doing that kind of research, I think, can be really valuable. And there's so many different kinds of research that can be valuable in service of those struggles, right? I mean, everything from the people who do legal research in order to defend land defenders or protesters who've come under attack or surveillance by the state, to the people who research the supply chains, right, that run across our world and actually are fundamental for resource extraction economy and profit making on a global scale, to some of the stuff that's closer to my heart is the kinds of research that's about really engaging with movements to think about some of the kinds of collective knowledge that we're developing together as we struggle, right? To figure out how do we sharpen some of our own analytical tools and our own organizing approaches and capacities, through sharing, right? Through sharing some of those lessons and through kind of lifting up some of the collective theorization that I think is often happening in struggles. But I do feel like there's a lot of space and actually many different kinds of forms that research that's aligned with transformative movements can take. But I do think we have to constantly remember about these other kind of more harmful ways that it can go. And the last thing I'll say on this is that there are so many kind of forces of push and pull to move even the kind of most good-hearted researchers toward more alignment with ruling institutions and relations and away from alignment with transformative movements. And any of us who've ever spent time in a university, I think, have probably experienced some of what that looks like. And we could talk in more detail about what some of those push and pull factors are, how we can relate with them and maybe resist some of them. But I think we actually need to be really upfront that is the kind of gravitational energy that's like where it's moving, and we have to figure out what are the other kinds of ways that we can set up poles that counter that gravitational energy.
Yeah, I would love to hear some of those. We're gonna let's get to that in 2 questions from now, I think. Let's talk a little bit more about this end of the spectrum, this more positive end of the spectrum. So even amongst the things I've read in my doctoral research and other places since, I've come across many different framings of ways to do research with movements, like everything from there's research about movements, there's research with movements, research are movement relevant research, research in service to movements, research by movements, and movement-led research, which that last one is the title of today's event. But I'm just wondering if you could help us. So I think all of those are sort of on that end of the spectrum, but they're not identical. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about some of those nuances and what kind of research you're advocating for.
Yeah, I've encountered many of those same terms, Jen, and I'm of two minds about this. Sometimes, so one thing is just that, as any of you who've spent time, particularly around the social sciences in universities, will know, there's a lot of people who love to nerd out on the question of methodology, right? Like methods. Like if you've ever had to write a thesis or something, that you probably, in the social sciences, you probably had to engage with some of this stuff around methods. And part of thinking about methods and methodology also often involves taking up some of these terms, like some of the terms that you mentioned, Jen, like people kind of really mapping out sort of different, what's their particular approach going to be for doing the particular kind of research that they're doing. And so there is part of me that is very impatient with discussions around methods and methodology. I feel like sometimes that stuff gets really fetishized, and it takes us away from talking about some of the much more kind of concrete and often very thorny questions that come up when we are trying to directly engage with people who are involved in struggles, right? And we're trying to do that in an ethical way that's actually about furthering those struggles. It's easy, I think, sometimes to kind of hang those more difficult questions on conceptual frameworks than it is to talk about some of the really specific kind of questions that come up. Like, for example, what do you do when someone tells you about activity that they've been involved in that they could potentially be criminalized for, right? Like, how do you navigate that kind of situation in an ethical way, while also really taking up seriously that, like, they engage in that activity for sound political reasons, right? That's just one example, but there's a lot of these kinds of things. So I want to be careful about us not getting too focused on the right kind of methodological terms. I do think there's useful stuff to get into with some of it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I always want to get to kind of stay focused primarily on the practical end of this, and not let us off the hook, basically, by using a particular methodology or methodological terms. So of those kinds of approaches that you named, Jen, I think one, so research about movements is frequently an orientation that scholars in the subfield known as social movement studies use. And they would talk about doing research about movements. And I think some of that scholarship is really, really useful. I mean, these are basically folks who are trying to understand how movements grow and develop, what some of their internal dynamics are, look at things historically. But often the about part means that the researchers themselves are not identifying as part of the movements. And they're not even necessarily thinking about what they're doing as in service to those movements, although it can be. It can be. But it's more just writing about something, right? And so I think the research about movements approach is often the weakest of the ones that you mentioned, because it doesn't have a lot of space for any kind of tangible connection or any kind of basis of accountable relationship between a researcher and a movement. I mean, I've said in the past that I'm not so much interested in research about movements or even research for movements as I am about research with movements. And that's the research with movements is the kind of, if I have a preferred approach, it's that one. And that's one where I see a kind of, I think together, side by side, researchers can be involved in movements as participants ourselves, and engaging in a research process together with other people around us, where we're identifying questions, we're talking through those questions, or refining some of those insights. We're trying to develop some kind of collective theorization out of that experience together. Now, I want to touch on movement-led research, though, because that is the name of this, and I feel like that's also really crucial for research for the front lines. as an initiative. And I think that in some sense is a slightly different approach, in that it's about specifically saying, look, not all researchers are necessarily embedded in movements, right? Sometimes there are circumstances where we're working as researchers, and what we want to do is offer up some of the skills that we have, some of the particular access to resources that we might have, to people who are involved in movements that we're not actually super directly connected to or are currently embedded in. Now, I don't think that precludes the possibility that we might become more involved in some of those struggles and organizing efforts. But I think it's about recognizing that we might be situated in different places socially. And this is another crucial point, right, in terms of thinking about research, is recognizing and always thinking really carefully about how are we coming in to this research? How are we coming into relationship with organizing efforts? Where are we coming from? And when I say where are we coming from, I'm really bringing up the question of social positionality, right? I'm thinking specifically about what kind of race, gender, sexuality, citizenship status, ability, educational circumstance, professional standing. Like, there's so many questions, I think, that go into shaping who we are and how we enter in to what we're doing. And I think these are things that are really worth thinking about. And with the movement-led research model, I think we can, particularly those of us who I think are coming from more advantaged positions, where we have access to certain kinds of skills and resources, we can think about, what do we want to do with this? Like, where do we want to plug this in? But as I said, I don't want to give up also on the possibility of us participating as comrades, right? As direct participants ourselves. So I don't think that some of those models that you mentioned, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that we can perhaps take up one or another at different times, based on the circumstances that we're in. And the overall orientation that I think many of those terms are getting at is one where we're trying to work in accountable ways on research that benefit movements, principally.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I think the way you frame that is really helpful to thinking about them as fluid and different entry points, but different potential endpoints. So maybe now let's go back to that push and pull and the different forces pushing researchers towards doing research that benefits the ruling institutions and powers, as you called them. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of what are the barriers you see for folks who are trying to do this kind of research, like the barriers, both personal, interpersonal, and institutional, that are being faced, and what are some strategies that researchers can use that you think might be helpful in overcoming some of these barriers to doing the kind of research we're naming here.
Yeah, so here, I'll talk specifically about some of those kinds of barriers and maybe some strategies for navigating those barriers that I think those of us who have been inside universities or have worked adjacent to universities have had to deal with, because I suspect that's kind of the majority of what we're thinking about here, although I recognize names from folks on this call for whom the university actually is not a primary reference point at all. And I think that's actually really wonderful as well. Like, I think that allows for other possibilities, but also some other and different challenges too. So in terms of barriers, one thing I want to name is just like time and resources, right? Like, I think all of us in various ways are experiencing having less time and fewer resources. And in universities, time and resources are often allocated based on you following a particular program. If you're a student, right, that's about you getting through your course requirements. That's about you producing perhaps a thesis that fits in some way with university expectations, and being directly accountable to people who are supervising you or are teaching you, right? And in many ways, your time and your resources are governed by that kind of matrix of power as it operates in that institution. I mean, there is a particular way, in fact, that produces a specific form of accountability. Like I often like to think about these questions in terms of like who is our accountability to? And the university, in very material, everyday ways, makes you accountable to itself, right? To people who are employed in supervisory roles within the university. And it makes it harder then for you to develop relations of accountability with movements, with organizations, with people who are engaged in struggle, for whom the university is not their primary reference point. And in fact, one of the barriers that really comes up is when we're doing research that's trying to work alongside movements, we can face real like disdain and sometimes actually like real consequences for choosing to stay, like keep ourselves focused and keep our resources directed toward people who aren't in that university context and who are perhaps doing disruptive kinds of things that are unsettling for ruling institutions. I mean, there's like so many kinds of barriers that we could talk about, but I do feel like resources and time frame a lot of this in like the material day to day. And I think part of navigating that, because we can't just kind of magically make it disappear. We can't wish it otherwise. These are the institutional contexts that we're in. So I think part of what we have to do is actually name these things as they're happening. The other thing that I think is really useful is to not go it alone, right? So one of the kind of fundamental organizing functions of the university is to get us to act as individuals and understand ourselves as individuals who are pursuing our own kind of very individual trajectory through the institution, whether that's as a student or as some kind of an academic pursuing a professional career. And that actually takes away the possibility for us to build relationships that could push against some of that like gravitational pull that I was talking about earlier, right? So I do think that a significant strategy for working with some of these barriers and some of that kind of like overwhelming pressure to do research in a particular way, in a particular direction, is find other people, right? Like build collectivity. And I mean, in a certain sense, this is a really basic point, and I think this is the fundamental point for basically everything that we're trying to do in society is find other people, build collectivity, because it's so much easier to push back against some of these pressures when we have other people alongside us who we're talking with, who we're sharing strategies with, who we're providing mutual support for one another through, and when we can pool resources and ideas. And it's actually much easier to collaborate with other people involved in struggle, other people involved in movements, when we approach them as collectivities rather than as individuals, right? Because that's how we can build some more accountable relations when we come. And when I'm talking about working with other people, I'm not talking about building like mass organizations necessarily, right? Like I'm saying, find 2 or 3 other people that you're on side with and figure out how you can start supporting each other and brainstorming together about what you're doing and what you can get access to and how, and what you can push up against. Like how far can you actually contravene some of the institutional pressures that you're facing in your particular circumstance? It's going to be easier if you've got a few people who have your back. And then the other thing is, I think part of working against or getting around some of these barriers, or at least recognizing them and sometimes sidestepping some of them, is developing our own kind of accountability. Like, so recognizing the way that the institution is setting up a particular kind of accountability for the type of research that we do, that's in alignment with its particular norms and prerogatives, We can see that, we can see what's happening. And we can say, what other kind of accountability do we want to build? And I mean, here, I should mention the Cree scholar Sean Wilson has this book, Research is Ceremony, where he, which is all about Indigenous research methods. And one of the, I think, very positive things that he offers in that book is a kind of conception of relational accountability, like a kind of Indigenous research and methodological approach that's based in relational accountability. And I feel like I've learned a lot from reading that, engaging with that. Also, I'm not Indigenous, and so I've been very reluctant to sort of just like take that up as my own. I've taken it more as a kind of source of inspiration or kind of a question of like, what would it mean for us to build relations of accountability as researchers, as part of transformative movements that are about that same, that are about a kind of relationality, about a kind of ethical relationality. And I think, you know, there's a few different parts to that. I mean, one is asking the question in a serious way, like, how do we determine what we research? Because if we just kind of go with the gravitational pull of the institution, it's going to suggest what we research is based on a complicated recipe or a complicated kind of mix of what happens to be trending academically in our field, what we happen to have maybe some like interest or curiosity about, what our supervisor or someone having supervisory function is maybe what they know about, right? So it's this kind of like weird mix. But I think it's worth asking, you know, in the spirit of relational accountability, maybe we should consult with people involved in movements and organizations that we care about to ask them about the kinds of questions that are worth researching. And that might be the kind of beginning of a basis for a different kind of relationship, right? That could kind of press up against some of those obstacles. I mean, I'll just give you an example that came up for me a number of years ago, where I was interviewing an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in 2007. And of course, I was asking him questions about direct action anti-poverty organizing and, you know, how OCAP does what it does in Toronto. And at one point he said, you know, we've had so many graduate students and academics over the years who've approached us and wanted to research us, but none of them have ever asked us what would be useful for us to research. Like what could we do that would be like helpful for advancing the struggles that you're involved in? And I was like, well, that's super fascinating. Like what would that be? And he immediately had this huge long list, right, of stuff about like, it'd be very helpful for us to understand better the drivers of gentrification and dispossession in downtown Toronto. Like, who are the real estate companies, right? Like, what are the connections between these developers? Like, what is the kind of political economy that's shaping this landscape that we're struggling in? And he had a bunch of other examples too. But that stayed with me, right? This idea that perhaps we don't start just with whatever question happens to be hitting us, but we start to develop questions in collaboration with other people who are very knowledgeable based in the struggles that they're fighting at the moment, you know? And I think the other question or the other sort of way that I've thought about this kind of accountability as pushing back against some of those institutional pressures is around the question of how do we give back? You know, like what do we actually, when we do research, what are we actually offering, and who are we offering it to? Because again, the sort of prevailing approach within the university is, well, you write journal articles, you give presentations at conferences, you maybe write papers for your courses, right? Like this is what you produce, and that's important. And what I want to suggest is maybe that's not actually the most important stuff. right? Like it might actually be useful to think about the other ways that we can give back as part of doing research alongside movements. And they might be much less tangible, right? They might be much less easily kind of fit into a thesis or a journal article. They might be about helping to build a workshop curriculum or doing a very small specific bit of research that's part of a campaign that's never going to get published, but is actually going to be really useful for people in terms of doing a power analysis, right, of their opponent. So I think that's one of the other sort of core issues, is recognizing that not everything we do as research with movements or led by movements is going to be legible or useful or even welcome within the universities that we are sometimes in. And in fact, we might have to kind of go in some divergent ways at times. But I do think that the significant point here is being really explicit about it, like really recognizing and naming these different kinds of pressures and dynamics, and then figuring out with other people some things that are possible, right? Some alternatives that are possible.
Hey, maybe we're going to take a break to give Beatrice, our interpreter, a break for 10 minutes. And what we're going to do during this time, also let Chris have a break. And we'll come back to you. We have more questions, Chris. And what we'll do is have little introductions from each of the co-presenters. So I'll first ask Jacqueline to present the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, and then I'll ask Christiana and Bengi to present the Social Justice Center, and then I'll present Research for the Front Lines, and then we'll come back to, I have one more question for Chris, and then we'll go to audience questions. So I'll hand it over to Jacqueline.
Hey everyone, hello again, Jacqueline here, she, her pronouns. Yeah, thanks so much Jen and Chris for this really captivating exchange. There's lots that I'm reflecting on slowly with my cup of tea. I see a question in the chat from Lean. Would we be able to have a copy of the recording at the end? Yes, I'm recording so we can circulate that. Yeah, so I'll present about the hub, and I'll try to do it in both languages as our interpreter will be taking a break during this time. Alors, bonjour tout le monde, je suis la co-directrice du Hub de mobilisation pour la justice climatique. I'm the co-director of the Climate Justice Organizing Hub. Nous sommes une structure de soutien pour les militants militantes qui luttent pour la justice climatique et tous les autres mouvements sociaux aux intersections de la justice climatique. So we support organizers who are fighting for climate justice, as well as those at the intersections of different social movements that collide with climate justice, which is many. Alors, nous entendons les besoins des militants, militantes, puis on répond avec les offres dans les formes des ateliers, des rassemblements, des événements comme ça. So we listen to the needs of organizers, and then we respond with offerings tailored to these needs in the form of workshops or gatherings or events like this. Yeah, maybe I'll take this time to plug a climate justice gathering that's happening 1 week from today. So we're hosting a cross-country climate justice check-in where we're going to gather updates from different groups working on different projects and campaigns. And this event has come from this need that's been expressed for deeper connective tissue between organizers and projects across the country. Alors, dans une semaine, on aura un événement qui s'appelle la mise au point sur la justice climatique across the country. Puis on va avoir des présentations des différents projets et on va avoir des espaces pour comme à rencontrer les autres gens dans différentes régions et entendre what projects are being worked on. Sorry, my French is not perfect. Et cet événement sera bilingue. On aura l'interprétation en français et en anglais. And I see Tom is posting some links in the chat. So if you're curious about the hub, feel free to follow up with those links. Hope to see you there.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Now, Bengi and Christiane, please go ahead.
Hi, I think I'm going to speak and Christiane is going to say the things in French. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad to be both collaborating with the research for the front lines for the second time in co-hosting an event. Also co-hosting this particular speaker who is a very dear friend of mine. I'm not sure if that needs to be said in French because that was pretty personal, but anyway, I'll start introducing the Social Justice Center at Concordia. Social Justice Center is a research center at Concordia University that has the aim of facilitating research related to social justice issue across disciplines and departments. Christiane, are you gonna say it after, like everything after, or should I stop?
Of course, everything after. So say what you have to say.
And we also offer most of our work, or what we aim to do, is to facilitate a space, or to open up a space where such research could happen. But more specifically, we also support not only events such as these, but especially graduate work at Concordia related to social justice research. We offer graduate fellowships. We offered 5 this year because we could, but normally we offer 4, and a postdoctoral fellowship. And one thing I kind of want to mention is, for this year, especially the events that we've supported and what we kind of wanted to shed light on or articulate or emphasize as a center has been, and this is very much in line with this today's topic, as well as the work that research for the frontlines is doing, in what it means to do social justice research, or what is the research, I mean, as a researcher, as an academic, as a scholar, but also what kind of research do social justice movements do. So a lot of the topics that have already been touched upon. So this is kind of an emerging line that we are following in the center. Thank you.
Merci, Bengi. Donc, grosso modo, le Centre de justice sociale est installé à Concordia. C'est depuis 2019 pour supporter la recherche sur la justice sociale. Bengi a dit qu'elle était très bonne amie avec Chris Dixon. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas cette chance-là, mais moi, j'ai lu son livre en 2015 et j'ai vraiment adoré ce livre-là. On sortait de la grève étudiante au Québec en 2012, donc il y avait beaucoup plus de gens qui étaient politisés à cette époque-là. Donc, le but du Centre de recherche à Concordia, c'est évidemment de supporter la recherche sur la justice sociale dans plusieurs disciplines, donc ouvrir des lieux où cette recherche-là va se produire, mais c'est aussi de supporter la recherche étudiante. Donc, on a des bourses étudiantes et des bourses postdoctorales. Cette année, on a offert 5 bourses étudiantes, pas encore de bourses postdoctorales, mais ça va aller pour l'année prochaine. Donc, la question qu'on se pose aujourd'hui, à savoir ce que ça signifie la recherche sur la justice sociale, c'est super pertinent pour le centre parce que c'est exactement le type de questions qu'on se pose nous aussi.
Thank you. I was thinking we should collaborate more on thinking about how the Social Justice Center at Concordia can help pull that gravitational pull away from the ruling institutions and towards research for social justice. So I think you're well positioned in that university to help that. And now I'm just going to share my screen for a minute, and I'm going to present Research for the Front Lines, which is a new initiative, and I will share it in the slides in English, but I'll speak in French. So, Research for the Front Lines est une nouvelle initiative qui met en relation les communautés et les organisateurs et organisatrices qui luttent pour la justice environnementale avec des chercheurs, chercheuses qui ont des temps à en faire. Nous aidons à établir et à soutenir des collaborations de recherche qui contribuent à résister au capitalisme extractif et colonial et reconstruire des alternatives. So it's a new organization, a new initiative. We're grassroots ourselves, and we link up, folks on the front lines with folks who have research time to offer. And so that's what we do. You can check us out on all these Facebook, Twitter, and our website. And
Jen,
if you're a part of a community or movement that would like some research support, get in touch through email. If
hey
you're
Jen, sorry
someone,
to interrupt.
Yep.
We can't see your slides.
Oh, that's super weird. Okay, let's try that again. You see them now?
Yes, we see you. Yes, okay, perfect.
Okay, so that was the first slide when I was speaking French. That's who we are, what we do, and there's all our contact information. And then I was just saying that if you're a community member or a grassroots organizer who's on the front line of these struggles and would like some research support, this is how you can contact us through email. And if you're a student or researcher with skills and time to offer, there's a sign-up form that we can, maybe Keith, can you share that sign-up form in the chat when you get a chance, no rush. And also, we also mobilize a pool of research mentors. So those are folks that maybe don't have as much time to offer, but have a lot of experience doing research with different kinds of methods. Kevin Walby, who I think is here today, is one of our research mentors, and he really taught one of our research teams about how to use access to information requests. So we have a pool of research mentors who we could just pick their brain when we need support or when one of our research collaborations could use some guidance or advice. So those are all the ways you can get involved with Research for the Front Lines. And you can just check out more on our website. So that is that. And that was our little break. And now it's time to go back to chatting with Chris. Are we ready? Okay. So Chris, I have one last quick question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. So folks, you can indicate if you want to speak by putting up your hand in the digital hand function, or putting just indicating with a star in the chat that you'd like to speak. And you could also just put your question right in the chat and we'll go for it that way. But Chris, so here's what I want to ask you lastly. What advice do you have? I mean, you've touched on this, but if there's anything left you have to offer, what advice do you have for researchers who are navigating the tensions between academic commitments, timelines, et cetera, and this accountability to movements or communities that we're talking about, as well as if you have any sort of principles or guidelines that you think folks who want to contribute to movement-led research could sort of, take to heart.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. And certainly, yeah, I mean, I feel like I've tried to touch on some aspects of this, particularly the question of building accountability, right? Like thinking through this question of relational accountability and what are some of the ways that might look. And also the point that I emphasized about collectivity, right? About finding other people, I feel is really a critical one. And I think part of what I was getting at in trying to talk about recognizing where we're coming in from, right? Like thinking about social positionality in terms of our research is understanding that our research, what we do, our research activities, they're never separate from us, right? So like one of the lies that academic institutions try to tell us is that we can do this kind of objective research work that has actually nothing to do with where we're coming from and who we are. But in fact, who we are, where we're coming from, always frames what we're doing, right? And I think recognizing that about ourselves, but also recognizing it about so many of the other people around us, particularly those who claim to have some kind of objectivity in the research that they're doing, and particularly those who claim that objectivity in defense of ruling institutions. But I think seeing that research is actually directly connected to us, right? And actually getting real clear on what are our investments, right, in doing what we're doing. And I think this is actually something that comes up even in the case of movement-led research, where we're trying to sort of put our resources and skills in the service of movements. I think it's always better on us to be able to think about, well, what is our connection to this? What is our investment in this fight? Because it's never, I mean, if we don't have an investment, right? If we don't have some kind of direct reason why we're willing to throw down on this, it is just charity. And that's actually another really sort of terrible model to go on here. We're trying to think about a different model that's actually about collaboration based in a shared struggle, even if we're situated in different places in relation to that struggle, right? And, you know, I think the other thing I wanted to emphasize that I don't think I've touched on is how useful it can be to consciously set our own goals. Because the institutions that we're in, whether they're universities or other kinds of institutions, they'll set goals for us, right? Like they have default goals of like what we're supposed to be doing. And again, if we want to resist some of that gravitational pull, then we actually have to set out some of our own aims. And I think those aims can be, you know, answering questions like, what kinds of contributions do we want to be making to social transformation, right? Who do we want to be collaborating with? And who do we want to ultimately benefit from what we're doing? And I think if we can get clearer on articulating some of those goals for ourselves, and again, even better, if you can do that in collaboration with some other people, I think they can kind of operate as like lodestars, right? Help us have a bit of a different orientation, perhaps trying to steer away from some of that pull that would otherwise take us toward just the kind of default orientations of a lot of academic institutions. So those are some kind of like general thoughts about trying to steer in a different direction and some of what might be helpful for us. But I don't want to lie. Like, it's really, it is not easy to try to do research alongside movements, particularly when you're working in institutional contexts that press you in a different direction. Like it's always about fighting and then assessing particular kinds of fights, determining which ones are worth taking on, and often having people be really frustrated with you. And at the same time, it's about being really vulnerable in relation to the movements and organizing initiatives with whom you're collaborating, right? Because you're basically saying, look, I'm willing to be accountable to you. You know, I'm willing to try and build a relationship here that's about furthering your aims. And that means most likely that you're going to do some stuff that, you know, is imperfect, where people are going to be frustrated with you or critical of you. And part of what you're going to have to do is own that, figure out how to keep working in that relationship and do better, right? So it's, none of this is going to be like straightforward. And in fact, a lot of it's going to be pretty challenging. And I'm sure, as many of you know, is really challenging. And anybody who tries to tell you otherwise is simplifying or lying to you.
Okay, that's honest and fair. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, enough of my questions. Time to go to audience questions. And the first one I see in the chat is from Simona. Simona's asking you, Chris, what advice do you have for researchers who are not affiliated with the university for getting started or involved in movement-led research? What are the differences in terms of barriers for non-university researchers?
That's great. Thank you for asking that question, because yeah, I as you see, I often end up speaking more to the people who are in universities than are not in universities. But I actually do think that there are some different kind of opportunities and challenges for those of us who are largely not in universities or not really even adjacent to universities at all. I think one of the challenges is that we may not have access to the same kinds of resources, whether those resources are like specific tangible things like access to like university libraries and like digital access to like journals and certain kinds of records and that kind of stuff. But we also might not have the like financial support to be able to put in the time. On the other hand, we're not bound by any of the expectations and guidelines that govern so much university-based research. We don't have to wade through like ethics protocols in order to interview people, for example, right? And I think one of the real possibilities for researchers outside of universities, and I think research for the front lines offers this possibility really, is getting connected without using the university as an intermediary at all, right? Like seeking out organizations, seeking out campaigns, seeking out collectivities of people in struggle, and being able to say, hey, I've got some time, some skills. I'd like to be able to collaborate with you on some stuff. I'd like to be able to offer some assistance here. And really not having to worry about trying to make that legible within a university context at all. And instead being able to just set up, what are your aims for this research in collaboration with who you're working with? And then figuring out how you get access to the things that you need in order to do that. But in a certain way, I think those of us who are situated outside of universities, we have some advantages because we don't have to deal with that kind of gravitational pull. But I think the thing that we need to work on is building relationships with people who are doing stuff, because otherwise it can feel like we're just kind of floating, right? Like disconnected from anything that's going on. And again, I do have the same advice for people in and outside of academic institutions on this, which is find some people, find some more people, like collaborate, right? Even if it's just a couple of other folks that who are interested in doing research for social justice, who are maybe similarly situated as you, like figure out what you can do together, what you can start together, and how you can connect.
Nice. So I'm hearing find some people. I'm hearing that Kevin Strong across. Nicholas, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Oui. Hello. Thank you so much for organizing this. Hopefully people can hear me now, not just a weird look. Good. I'm currently doing an honors thesis, which is an undergraduate research, sort of truncated. I get to have Bengi, who is here, as an advisor, and we're currently working out questions. Like, I'll make it quick. Basically, I'm trying to use some of the climate movement's capacity where you have thousands upon thousands of white people asking government to do something, and instead try to use a social reproduction lens. Maybe you can give your take on what social reproduction is to you, and sort of try to build mutual aid groups or something like that. And I wonder, like, if this fits into the movement-led narrative. I myself, as an activist, have been part of this, trying to build coalition from marginalized voices. And my honors thesis I'm trying to use as a way of redistributing capacity, if you will, looking at, like, I'm hoping to ask what the issues are that they're facing, the barriers that they're facing, that those with privilege that often are at university can help and support. I'm also trying not to land on my face as some white dude going like, what do you need? So I don't know if you have any insights on your thoughts on social reproduction as a lens and mutual aid as a form of transformative action.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bengi, were you going to say something about it, or you just put your hand up because you were like identifying yourself? Okay.
I want to ask a question after everyone, so
okay,
it's
got it.
my kind of, should I lower it? I don't want to confuse anyone.
No, I'll respond to this one. Yeah. So that sounds super promising. Let me see if I understand when you're talking about a social reproduction lens. The way that I understand that is taking up so the concept of social reproduction being how do people go about daily and nightly caring for one another and producing ourselves as available to continue going, right? And continue like working and living together in society. And of course, social reproduction is a term that comes a lot out of the like, Marxist feminist tradition for thinking about the like generational reproduction of people and reproduction of people every day, like being able to work and that sort of thing. So am I understanding correctly in terms of how you're thinking about social reproduction? Yeah, so I think I myself have been really influenced by that approach for thinking about human activity, right? And I'm particularly interested in the work of care. I think social reproduction is like quite a fancy term that actually in some ways is just talking about caring labor, of the various forms of caring labor that happen in society that kind of keep society going, that are often really made invisible by colonial and capitalist relations, right? Like that tend to focus on so-called productive labor, which is like labor that's producing a profit for somebody in a workplace. So I think the question that you're raising, if I understand it well, is about applying that kind of approach to thinking about mutual aid efforts as organized by activists and organizing communities. And to me, I mean, maybe some of you have read Dean Spade's recent book, Mutual Aid, which is, I think, a really super interesting intervention into thinking about some of these questions, a short one, but I think this is actually a really rich and important topic for investigating right now, because people have been starting up mutual aid initiatives all over the place, right? Particularly in the context of the pandemic, but actually mutual aid infrastructure as part of movements has a really, really long history, particularly in and among people who have been have faced some of the most violence and exclusion. So, like I think this is a great thing to get into. I think the question in terms of doing research that is in some way movement led, that gets at these topics, is, I think, does raise questions around, well, how do you figure out what will be useful for people who are doing some of the mutual aid organizing work, right? And I think there's different ways to approach that, but I do think it's really worthwhile to have some open-ended conversations, particularly with people that you hopefully have been able to build some kind of trusting relationships with, around like, what's going to be helpful here, right? Like, what's going to help build deeper collective analysis? What's going to help people to identify some of the perhaps major challenges that they're encountering, and then think about how to circumvent some of those challenges. And even identifying, I think, questions that no one has good answers for right now in that work can potentially be useful, particularly if that's, you know, part of a conversation with people who are directly engaged in doing that work. So anyways, those are just some kind of general thoughts in response to your question.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to go to the next question. Thanks for your question, Nicholas. So the next one is about methodology. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. This person, Pelin, is asking if you could talk a bit more about how do you go about facilitating a process of deciding on methods together when you're working with movements in a way that like keeps the options open and not just your conventional research methods that might be the obvious ones. Like, so that was my paraphrasing.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's actually, I think, a really important one as well. So one thing is that you can't always have a completely like fully participatory collaborative process around deciding on methods. Depending on what your circumstances are, you may already be locked into a particular kind of set of methods for what you're doing. Whether that's like you're already engaged in talking to people, you're already trying to interview people. That means that you've actually already embraced a particular methodological approach. Or maybe at the request of an organization, you're doing some Information Act requests, like Jen mentioned earlier, right? That means that you're taking a particular methodological approach that's about trying to investigate what's actually happening within the state, right? Within some of these people who compose the state. So I think, but then of course there are circumstances where you may be able to build trusting relationships with a group of people, and from the get-go have a conversation that's like, hey, I want to do this particular, I'm interested in doing research with you, you know, what would be helpful here? And then you could talk together perhaps about how you might want to do that and how other people could feel invested in doing that work together. So I think there's kind of different kinds of circumstances for different people. But I think across all of those, the main thing that you can do as a researcher with a commitment to working with movements is to try to keep talking about it, right? Like keep open the possibility for critically discussing what you're doing, and remaining open to questions, even questions that may upend some of what you're doing or how you've been doing it, to the extent that you might realize that actually you might need to redo something in a certain way, or actually the particular approach that you have been using methodologically might be exposing people to harm in some way. You know, like, I mean, I do think there's something to be said here about a trauma-informed approach to thinking about research as well, that doesn't reinscribe harms and traumas that people have experienced in the past. But so the point is, I don't have a formula for you on that. I think it's more a question of how you build relationships and keep open the possibility for reassessment as you're doing things.
If I may, I wouldn't mind chiming in on that one, may I?
Please do.
So one thing we've been doing with research for the front lines is having a very, very clear line that the community or movement folks that we're doing research with are the main decision makers, all the way through, from the research question through the methods choice. And sometimes the researchers, one of the things they're tasked with is like find out what some possible methods that could be useful are, and then being able to say, here are some options, what do you think? So I have found that very clarifying. Instead of sort of wondering how we do this together, just having a very clear position that the movement or community folks are the decision makers at all times. And then, I've found that really useful. But at the same time, there's a lot of power in which methods you bring to the table as options and what you might not know about or what you might be missing or not considering. So we need to be thinking about that too, and constantly wondering what we might be leaving off the table. There's my 2 cents. And the next question for you, Chris, is a two-parter from Antonio. And Tony asks, where have you seen this go bad? Do you have any examples of research that set out with an intention to work collaboratively with a movement, but then it failed in that attention? And the second part is, how have you dealt with the personal tension of being embedded in a movement as a researcher, but not explicitly being a member of that movement? There's 2 parts.
So I have so many anecdotes of research that's gone bad, and I actually don't really want to try and single out any particular researcher on this. I mean, a lot of the things that kind of came flooding into my mind and reflecting on that question are stories I heard from activists who are not the researchers after the fact, about a book coming out, for example, that quoted them as saying something or described some activity that they were involved in. And they were like, they never asked me if they could talk about this. And now it's like public record, right? Like now I'm being portrayed as saying this thing or doing this thing. Or sometimes even published work that has recounted discussions, right, within organizations where the researcher didn't actually ever check to see if it was okay to share those discussions. So that's like a particular kind of way that research can go bad, when it basically is sharing information or portraying people in a particular way that they never consented to. And that can be that they're being portrayed in ways that actually don't accurately represent them, or it can be that they're being portrayed or described in ways that may accurately represent them, but actually endanger them in some way, or like undermine their objectives. So that's one way I think that research can go bad. I've also seen examples of people who've done like actually quite principled research and really tried to be very ethical. And then at the stage when they had to turn it into a thesis or a journal article or something, completely cut off contact, like, because they just didn't know how to then navigate the space of turning what was like very, very kind of collaborative work into something that fit within the expectations of what that final piece of work would be. And then there being a lot of like discord and conflict, right, around that final product, because there was actually like a pretty good process, but then that process was actually quite severed from the final outcome. And I understand the kinds of like academic pressures that produce that, but I think that is another kind of way that research can go badly, right, and can be actually really damaging to those attempts at building accountable relationships, can really like undermine them in significant ways. There's other examples too, but those are some of the things that like come to mind most prominently for me as research that can go bad. And then I'm trying to remember the second part of this question. Oh, right, the personal tension. So so this is another thing where I feel like I should not sugarcoat it. It's actually really difficult, I think, to do movement-based research when you are not explicitly a member of a movement. It's actually much simpler when you do have some shared political history. You have been in some way engaged in the struggle, even if just in a kind of consistent supportive role. It's much easier, I think, because you have the basis to be able to build some trust and some relationship. It's actually a lot harder to in some way be embedded but not explicitly be a member of a movement. Like it's actually a lot more work to build that kind of trust, and it takes longer, frankly, because you have to establish a track record as someone who is going to be trustworthy, who's actually going to follow through, and is open to being accountable for what you're doing. So in the kind of research that I've done, I've always worked on doing research with movements that I've been involved in before, and that's the way that I've evaded that challenge. And it seems like to do otherwise, I think, is totally possible. I've seen examples of it. I have people who mentored me who became involved in movements as they were doing research on those movements, but that took a long time for them to like get to the stage where they had some real trust and a basis for collaboration. And part of that, as Jen, I think you really explicitly and helpfully pointed out, was about being really open to people saying like, no, like this is not how it should go, or I want to know what the other options are here, you know?
Thank you for that question, or those two questions, Antonio. Now it's Bengi's turn to ask a question.
Yeah, I made a big deal out of it. I don't know how exactly to frame this, and I don't want to sound cynical or pessimistic, but I also kind of would like maybe Jen to jump in, or anyone to jump in. It's more kind of my way of dealing with some of these issues rather than a question. But so Chris, you started by kind of mentioning or like outlining how there are different kinds of research that are being done, and there's also kind of research that is done by movements. Maybe that's like in my mind, that's more, there's knowledge created through movements, by movements. And what I'm trying to kind of grapple with as a researcher and as someone who's involved in multiple movements, not necessarily as a researcher, but at the end of the day, yes, there are different ways of creating knowledge or doing research. But at the end of the day, the one that we do as academics attached to institutions are the ones that get codified as research. There's a hierarchy between different knowledges that are created according to who does it, where it's done, and the kind of form it takes, as you kind of also mentioned in different ways. But so I think like we have kind of that, we are the researchers, and like how do we, where I think that what we should be doing is more decentering the research we do, or the research that is attached to institutions. So I guess what I want to know is like, how does anyone here, but mostly Chris and maybe Jen, and yes, I mean, Kobe is mentioning Aziz, who's passed away last year, as very eloquently and very like systematically writing on activist knowledge all throughout his life. And he was a good friend of mine too, and as he was probably of many people here. So I feel like kind of how do we like do movement-led research, especially if we are attached to institutions or like institutionalized spaces of academia, while also kind of trying to decenter the research with capital R. And like kind of like what I've been thinking, for instance, what Chris, when you were mentioning about the research needs and like a power map, for instance, or like what drives gentrification in downtown Toronto. In my experience, the movements that I'm in, they pretty much know like what's happening, or like where it's rooted, and like through the knowledge that they created, not only by like moving together, so they created about organizing, but also they're very much aware of the systemic roots of like these things. It's just they're not taken seriously, and they need a researcher like me or an academic or a professor to actually say, sometimes go in the court and testify, hey, this is what's happening. So I mean, like, I think there's like, that's kind of the conundrum I'm in, like, how do I keep doing this, but while also actually trying to kind of give more legitimacy and power to the knowledge that is created outside of academic spaces. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with this is my first question. And the second question, I think, if you can comment on, because you mentioned like what you were most interested in was kind of this collective knowledge created in movements and how we work together to sharpen the tools of organizing, as you said. So can you comment on that, like as a, like, is there anything concretely you can tell us that would like maybe inspire us to?
Those are big questions from Bengi. Thank you for those. And I should say too, I really appreciate all of these questions. Like this is really, and I don't think that I have definitive answers to any of this stuff. I'm happy to share some like beginnings of thoughts with you, but I hope this is a conversation that we can continue in various ways as well. And you should never trust anyone who tells you that they have it all figured out, particularly when it comes to research on movements. If they do, they're also lying to you. So on the conundrum that Bengi just mentioned, I really appreciate you kind of focusing in specifically on the kind of capital R research, and particularly the way that there are certain kind of roles in our society that get set up as the legitimate capital R researchers. And certainly professors, right? Academic professors, but also certain kinds of, there's other folks too, right? People who run, like I live in Ottawa, right? So there's like a whole layer of people who work in national level think tanks and policy institutions who are seen as like legitimate researchers. These are the people that journalists quote in addition to government officials, right? They're all seen as experts. So yeah, I think there is a real question there around what do we do with that kind of official capital R research or expertise? And I think that's a different question, or that question has different answers to some extent based on who we are and how we're situated. Because for one thing, like not all of us here are professors. Like a lot of folks are students and don't have access to those same kind of like forms of social legitimacy. But I think if we do have access to that kind of legitimacy, we can think about how to enlist it strategically at times in the hands of organizations and campaigns. And I think that there are times when organizations and campaigns make really smart strategic choices about trying to have a capital R researcher sort of put out something, right, to support what they're doing, with the recognition that in our society as it's currently structured, that's what's going to get attention. That's what's going to get legitimacy. And at the same time, I think we can resist getting too wrapped up in taking on that role or feeling that legitimacy. Like, so always relating to it in an opportunistic way, not in a way that's kind of like as an operator or as like a career builder, right? So like recognizing like, okay, for the strategic purposes of this campaign, because people are asking me to fulfill this role, I'll step up and be this pretend capital R researcher, recognizing that it's based in a particular set of social relations. And that of course, the other people have just as much important expertise to bring to bear on this. I think part of the antidote for that is in our daily practice, not having or avoiding having the only thing we do be research, avoiding having the only movement work we do be research, right? Like, because in fact, like some of the people that I know and love who are academic intellectuals who have been very committed to movements, the most valuable work they have done has not been writing about those movements, has not been doing research for those movements. It's been doing some of the like nitty gritty daily work, right? Of setting up meetings, facilitating things, being engaged in direct action, taking care of people, moving resources, fundraising of various kinds, right? Like stuff that's like super, thank you, Mike, baking cookies, like, you know, stuff that's actually in some ways behind the scenes, but is just as vital. So I think that's part of decentering it too, is sometimes opportunistically, oh, Kobe says coat check at activist events, right on. Yeah, there's like so many ways, right? And that's part of actually engaging in a movement, which means we all do all of the work. We share it in various ways, right? And rather than having these kind of specialized roles, and then we make explicit decisions when we take up those specialized roles to further strategic aims, but in discrete kinds of ways. I think that it's possible to like work through that conundrum in that way. It's not easy. I think there's always a tension there. Now I see we're at just past 2 o'clock. Jen, should I answer this second question, or do you think we should move into wrap up?
I would say if you have a short answer, and then we'll move to wrap up, if that's okay. But,
okay.
I mean, don't cut yourself off if you're on a roll.
Well, I appreciate everyone sticking around. I guess. So the second question that Bengi asked was about the building kind of collective reflection, which, as I mentioned, yeah, it's like something that's really close to my heart. And me and actually Doug Bevington, who is on the Zoom call right now, a whole bunch of years ago when we were angry graduate students, wrote an article where we basically criticized a bunch of the existing scholarship on social movements. And one of the things, and we brought in this concept that we called movement relevant theory. But part of the argument we made in that article that I really stand by today, I'm really glad that we dug into this together, was we talked about movement-generated theory, right? We said, look, there's all this stuff that gets called theory, particularly in academic discourse. But in fact, if you spend any time in a movement, you'll see that people are constantly theorizing. They're constantly coming up with new ideas, new ways of understanding things, of critically assessing the circumstances and the terrain of struggle that they inhabit. And of course, every movement has its own internal conflicts and debates and fights about things, which are also a part of movement-generated theory. And so I feel like basically any time that we're trying to do research with movements that's actually about how people are organizing, like what we're doing, that should always be the starting point, is like, what is the existing movement-generated theory? What are the questions and debates and ideas that people are already engaged in producing? And I mean, this is something, you know, the radical historian Robin Kelley often talks about, particularly in his lovely book, Freedom Dreams, right? About like one of the most gorgeous things that movements create is new ideas and new visions. And I really do feel like that's an excellent starting point for a lot of research. Now, that's not necessarily a useful starting point for when we're trying to research our enemies, when we're trying to research ruling institutions. But I think it can actually still serve as a kind of grounding for us, even as we do other kinds of research that are in some ways much less uplifting. I mean, I'll give you one final example of this, which is my collective here in Ottawa, Punch Up. We spent the last year going through city reports to learn about all the complaints against the Ottawa Police Services, right? To really try and understand, like, how much damage are they doing in our city? How do they account for that? And of course, their accounting is profoundly limited. But this was like research that was really quite devastating, right? Because it's all about the cops hurting people in the place where I live. And for me, that was important. That felt like an important contribution to the defund campaign in this city, to be able to look at some of these complaints and how the cops evade them, basically, like evade any accountability or criticism. But for me, it was important to sort of keep coming back to the movement-generated theory that's coming out principally from the movement for Black Lives, that's saying, look, there's another whole possible way that we could be living, right? That doesn't require this carceral state. And to me, that was kind of the compass that helped me through what was otherwise some like pretty just demoralizing research.
Okay, folks, it's time for thank yous and goodbyes. Want to start by thanking you, Chris, so much for spending this time, for sharing some of the insight and knowledge you've built over the years of doing this kind of work. Thank you so much for being here. It's really appreciated.
And I just really want to thank you and everyone else again for joining the conversation today. I wish we were all in one big room together so that we could actually do a solidarity clap or some other cheesy exercise. But it's really been a joy to talk about these things. I hope we have opportunities to continue some of these conversations.
Yeah, let's do it. Research for the Front Lines is aiming to host an event once a month. So last month we talked to Kevin Walby. This month we're talking to you, Chris. And so we're open to ideas for other events that help build our capacities, our collective capacities to do this kind of research at the service of transformative movements or with transformative movements. So thank you so much to Bengi and to Jacqueline and to the other Chris Dan and others who helped put this together, and to everyone who showed up, and to the folks who asked the questions. I'm sorry to the folks whose questions we couldn't get to. But yeah, keep in touch and keep up the good work, everyone. Bye.